which was prevalent at that time. And as we know, in COVID-19, the treatment guidelines and protocols have kept changing, and a lot of physician discretion and a lot of government advisories which kept coming in. But most of these patients did have some sort of combination, either of hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, doxycycline, ivermectin, remdesivir, some use of steroids, antibiotics, in some patients with severe illness, tocilizumab, and of course, oxygen support and ventilation as required. And we followed up these patients for 28 days post-discharge. As I said, we had total of 1079 patients. Out of these 1079, 694 patients required ICU admission because of severity of the illness. Our focus in this study was these 694 patients, and I'll talk about it later as to why. Out of these 694, about 48%, 333 received plasma in addition to supportive care, and 361 received only supportive care. And as I said initially, one center had a bigger experience. So majority, 70% of these patients who were given plasma came from one center in South Delhi. It's actually not a center, it's a complex of 2 hospitals. The rest of the 2 other hospitals contributed to about only 30% of plasma patients, whereas more of non-plasma cases came from the other 2 hospitals, but all 4 hospitals were part of the same chain, Max Healthcare, and from Delhi itself. So the standard of care was uniform across, except that one center had a bigger experience with using plasma. And this, I've already said that we included patients with moderate and severe COVID-19. All these criteria were there, which were fulfilled. And we excluded any patient who did not require oxygen in any form. And of course, selection for the plasma donors, this goes as by the Drug and Cosmetic Second Amendment Act 2020. I would not go into the details, but essentially our donor group comprised of young adults, mostly males, because only nulliparous women could be included, so that proportion was much smaller. And we initially, when we started using plasma, we did not have the antibody assessment kit. So about the initial samples, we kept storing them at -80. And when the kit was finally available, these initial samples of 36 donors were screened retrospectively, and 12% we found had inadequate antibody response. But subsequent to that, all other donors were screened for antibody using the 2 centers used a different kit and 2 other centers used a different kit, which one was fully quantitative, the other was semi-quantitative. But we use these criteria for accepting the donor plasma. And as we know, standard was to take 400 ml of plasma, and each donation for the recipient was for 200 ml of plasma, which was infused over an hour and a half. And depending upon a physician's decision whether a second dose of plasma was needed or not. And as I said, patients not requiring oxygen, pregnancy and lactation, these were excluded. And clearly, we set a very simple primary objective as to mortality benefit. We did want to see also whether it prevents a patient from going on to invasive ventilation, and whether it has an impact on mortality in more critically ill patients. So as I said, if we see the overall cohort of 1079 patients who were in ICU and outside of ICU, that means all severity which we included, we found no difference in the outcome in terms of mortality between the plasma and the no plasma group. But when we see the sub-cohort of patients who were in ICU, which were 694 patients, we saw that, as I said, 48% received plasma and 52% did not receive plasma. In this, the mortality benefit was evident. The p-value was less than was 0.02, and the mortality in the plasma group in ICU was 25% vis-a-vis 33%. And further going down into this group, we saw that this reduced mortality in the plasma group was specifically seen in an age group of 60 to 75, 26% versus 43%, with even a better p-value of 0.004. And in females in this age group of 60 to 75, the mortality benefit was even more, 23% versus 53%, with a highly significant p-value. Then we further drill down into mortality benefit in terms of presence of comorbidities and the level of sickness of the patient by needing ventilation. So what we found was significant difference in mortality was observed in patients who had at least one comorbidity, 22% versus 36%. And especially a female having a comorbidity, the mortality difference was extremely significant, 6% versus 49%. And even a person having two comorbidities, the mortality benefit was there, but it did not reach that statistical significance. And this was blinded. So whether a person has hypertension, diabetes, or coronary artery disease, in this subcohort of population, there was no statistically significant difference in terms of mortality benefit. Very interestingly, we found that patients with hypothyroidism, the mortality benefit in ICU patients with plasma was 19% versus 42%. Now, this we have put in our conclusion that this needs further evaluation and studies as to why in hypothyroidism this difference is coming up. And of the 38 women in 60 to 75 age group with one comorbidity, 12 were given plasma and only one death. And 26 who were not given plasma, 13 of them died, so 50%. And finally, what we say that patients who were of severe COVID, we saw that 101 patients were those who progressed from needing non-invasive ventilation to invasive ventilation. And there were 316 patients who remained only on non-invasive. Plasma did not prevent a patient from going on to from non-invasive to invasive ventilation. But when we see the mortality in patients who are on ventilator, what we found is patients on ventilator had a lower mortality in the plasma arm, 37% versus almost 50% in the patient in the non-plasma arm. And this was more so if a patient was on invasive ventilation, with a difference between 63% and almost 90% in the plasma and no plasma group. But we did not see this mortality benefit if the patient were very sick. So if they were on invasive ventilator and in septic shock requiring vasopressors, mortality was very high in plasma and no plasma group and did not offer any benefit. And in our study, about 26%, that 26 patients, that's about 8% of patients were given convalescent plasma second dose, also depending as per the physician's discretion. So just about one or two slides more. The PLACID study, we all know the Indian ICMR study, which is the only large prospective randomized control blinded study in which they had taken 464 patients across 39 different hospitals. In that study, they had found no statistically significant difference in the mortality between the plasma and the no plasma group. However, some differences from that study and our study was that in the PLACID study, they included a cohort of moderately severe patients, whereas we had moderate and severe, and including life-threatening COVID patients. And it was actually in this cohort where we found mortality benefit and not in the moderately ill patients. And in fact, there's a very interesting meta-analysis by Clayson et al., where they have put all the randomized controlled trials and said that if we remove the PLACID study, all other RCTs have shown a 51% reduction in mortality rate in patients who have been given plasma versus no plasma. So 19% versus 29% mortality rate. And to conclude, I would say what we found in our study was the use of convalescent plasma reduced mortality in severe COVID-19 elderly patient above age of 60 years, particularly females, those with comorbidities, and especially those who required some form of ventilation, whether non-invasive or invasive. This beneficial effect was lost when we studied the entire cohort of patients across varying severity of illness. So that means in our study, we did not find plasma giving any benefit when it was the milder moderate spectrum of illness of patients who were like involved with low flow of oxygen, or patients who were extremely critically ill and in septic shock. In the middle group category, especially elderly, especially females, especially with comorbidities, who have just gone on to invasive ventilation or BiPAP, that's the group of patients where the mortality benefit seems to be maximum. So, of course, further research is now required into this subgroup of population. We did have some limitations, like it's clearly a retrospective study. During this entire 3-4 months of study period, the treatment regimens, which we call the standard of care, or the which was received by both the groups, kept changing, but it was then spread across both the arms. Majority of the patients in plasma, as I said, 70% were recruited from one large complex. Unfortunately, we did not have information on the antibody levels of the recipients, of the patients who were given plasma. But these limitations notwithstanding, we were still able to identify a subset of patients with COVID-19 who are likely to benefit from convalescent plasma. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely amazing. And we are all learning about COVID, and everything is changing. So it is not at all surprising that the circumstances in which you did the trial was also changing. Nevertheless, like you pointed out, other than the PLACID study, every study has shown the benefit. Uh, so once more, I thank you very much and hand over back to the organizers for the next session.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll now move on to the panel discussion. The first panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Suresh Menon, who's been part of many medical departments of pharmaceutical companies. And his panelists are Dr. Kiran Marthok, CRO, Dr. Arun Agarwal, member of EC Max and ex-president of DMC, Dr. Radhika Boba, CRO, and Dr. TP Sau, PI. Over to you, Suresh sir.
Yeah, good evening to everyone, and thank you, Purvish, for inviting me to be a part of today's very interesting deliberations. Actually, the topic which has been assigned to our panel is so vast that we could have easily consumed all the time available for this webinar. Unfortunately, I know we don't have that luxury, so I'll try to be as brief as possibly we can. If one were to really trace the evolution of clinical research in India, most of us would agree that even at the beginning of the century, there were hardly any serious clinical research happening in India. It was in 2005 when the regulations were changed and very, very critically changed to allow parallel phase clinical studies to be set up in India, that the floodgates were opened. Because prior to 2005, India could actually initiate only studies one phase behind that of global development. So when this happened in 2005, as I said, the floodgates literally opened. But unfortunately, we are all wiser in hindsight. And if I look back, I was part of the whole bandwagon even in 2005. We realized as a group that, various stakeholders were underprepared to take on this very vital responsibility. You look at regulators, they did not have the bandwidth nor the infrastructure to review protocols, to review and actually pass assessments on causality, so very critical in clinical research. Look at ethics committees, the again, the training of ethics committees, the kind of expertise that you had in ethics committees. Even independent ethics committees flourished in those days, and obviously they could actually kind of approve a protocol to be set up in a center outside the city where the ethics committee was located. It was as bad as that. When you look at investigators, the Indian investigators, I think I would stick my neck out and say, even amongst an august gathering of leading oncologists, that the average Indian investigator has still not able to differentiate between clinical practice and clinical research. They still feel that clinical research is an extended arm of clinical practice, which all of us would now agree is far from the truth. When you look at sponsors, the other stakeholders, they started taking advantage. Now, major players, for example, had interest of marketing those drugs in India, but there were, many fly-by-night operators whose only intent was to use the Indian population for setting up and conducting clinical trials with no intent to market the drug here. And look at India, it was fertile from a clinical research perspective. Large patient population, infectious diseases, lifestyle diseases, oncology, you name it, and you have patients galore. Large network of medical colleges, private corporate hospitals. So there was no dearth of investigating centers. You had an English-speaking population and English-speaking investigators, and also computer savvy. What more do you wanted really to bring clinical research into India? But over a period of time, what really happened is, there was a lot of bad press which clinical research got. And I would be brief in highlighting only two of the most critical elements that went awry in those days. One was the whole process of administering informed consent. And the second, obviously, was deaths related to clinical trials. And many of us would remember that in the years 2010, 11, 12, there was a lot of noise created even in the parliament. Media did a big disservice in terms of how it covered clinical research and deaths related to clinical research. And obviously, what got highlighted in the media was the number of deaths year on year, which were in patients who are participating in clinical research, not actually getting into the details to know whether the clinical research, either the drug or a clinical related intervention, was really responsible for that death or not. And there's no better audience than you oncologists, because in oncology, one of the most common causes of death is natural disease progression. So if a death occurs in a patient who's on an oncology trial, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is causally related. But this was the gap which existed in terms of the perception which was built in the minds
You
of
need to engage with your panelists.
Yeah. So I'm just coming there, Purvish bhai. So the main challenge which was there was the informed consent and deaths in trials, and that is where the audio video recording came into play with administering the informed consent. And number two was the compensation guidelines. In addition, there were a lot of balancing which was done from a patient-centric perspective in terms of ethics committee registrations, in terms of investigators providing an undertaking, sponsors providing an undertaking that they have a responsibility to actually market those drugs for which they do clinical trials, etc., etc. The pendulum then swung, and now as we speak, I think there's a fair amount of equipoise or balance in terms of where we really are. So to set the ball rolling in terms of what our panelists feel with this background, where I've tried to be extremely brief, I begin and go to Dr. Radhika first, because, Radhika, when you look at it from an overall sponsor perspective, where do you think are we currently? Because as you know, the history immediately after the 2012 crisis, many sponsors backed out, and now slowly but surely they're coming back. So how do you see the scene from a sponsor's lens as we speak today?
Thank you, Dr. Menon. Good evening to all of you. From the sponsor perspective, from 2013, when we look at the number of clinical trials at 16, it had fallen down to 16 from 500. I'm just giving you figures that I've got from the CDSCO website to where we are currently at 158. I'm only talking about global clinical trials. Even those days, when many sponsors backed out. We had sponsors such as Novartis, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and few of the larger CROs still persisting in trying to come into India to conduct trials. Most of the medium and the smaller sized biotech companies, which worked a lot in the field of oncology, actually backed out. Rare diseases took a beating. Having said that, once there was a clarification and the 2019 guidelines, the new guidelines were released for clinical trials, there has been more clarity that has been issued by the CDSCO, based on which sponsors are returning to India. Their main concerns before coming into India, they do a really in-depth feasibility, of course, from the site perspective, but the other questions that they actually have, Dr. Menon, are about compensation, how compensation is handled, how SAEs have to be treated. Are they going to be completely responsible, irrespective of whether the patient has been negligent and has had an accident? And will the sponsor also have to take, the complete responsibility for treating such patients? The other one is also on the responsibility that rests with the ethics committee of the institutions and the responsibility of the principal investigators. Because you rightly said that, of course, again, my apologies, because I've worked with a number of you and I've had fantastic working relationships and your sites have been good. But we still do have sites where principal investigators do not pay due attention to documentation and the conduct of clinical trial, irrespective of training, irrespective of the oversight that is coming. And that's where sponsors really face a problem. But having said that, when we look at the number of clinical trials now,
can we move to the compensation part? That's the focus of our discussion. Let's not get deviated.
No, we are not getting deviated.
We have
Definitely.
Arun Agarwal here, who was the committee chair for the compensation. Please ask him about how he calculated the compensation formula.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Menon, back to you.
Yeah. So, Purvish bhai, the only point is I saw that compensation is also getting discussed later on in a session. So, my question to Dr. Agarwal specifically for this session, because it's looking at the prior to trial initiation kind of scenario, is what were the thoughts, sir, in the minds of the regulators, the government, and the expert committee which you chaired, behind shaping these, very, very novel and innovative compensation guidelines for India?
Thank you, Dr. Menon. Thank you, Dr. Parikh. Thank you, Dr. Sandeep Budhiraja, for introducing me. I think if I try to think about the compensation, uh, what happened before 2013 and what happened after 2000. I think 2013 is the dividing year between in the history of Indian clinical trials, that what happened before and what happened after, right? No doubt, as we were discussing, and Radhika also mentioned that perhaps in the beginning of somewhere around 2010, before that, India was expecting lot many trials, clinical trials to come, and that is why there was sudden booming of all the courses related to clinical trials. But at the same time, there were certain observations which were picked up by the media or by some of the NGOs. And if I recollect correctly, it was in 2012 and 11, then the parliament was also involved. I still remember then Health Minister giving a statement about the clinical trial, because one of the headlines in all the newspapers that a couple of thousand patients died due to clinical trials. And all of you know about it. And then there was an PIL. So it was a combined effect of the impression being created in the mind of society, in various sections of society, as well as PIL, that uh, gave Supreme Court an opportunity to have dialogue with Ministry of Health. And then out of the dialogue and the directions, the Ministry of Health was told that do something and come back to us, and then rules and regulations were framed. And if I remember correctly, Dr. Menon, it was a notification of 30th January 2013. And thanks to my senior colleague, I want to remember him, unfortunately no more, Professor Ranjit Rai Chaudhary, who is known to all of us, and his recommendations were very strong. And that was one of the outcomes, that the compensation should also be looked after. So when the notification of 30th January was sent to Health Ministry, and then Health Ministry started thinking about each and every component of those recommendations, including compensation.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
that compensation, then they, in their wisdom, they decided that let there be an expert committee. And that time, our Dean Maulana Azad Medical College, and somehow they decided to pick me up. I'm thankful to Ministry of Health. And of course, I was supported by a big group of my expert members from Department of Pharmacology and different clinical subjects, and from consumer forums, from industries, NGOs. And how did we come to this formula of compensation? You see, we try to think what is happening globally. Dr. Suresh, Dr. Parikh, you know it very well. The globally, say in United States and all, if there is any such claim of compensation, which is usually decided by the judiciary. You agree?
Yes, sir. And most of them, sir, are also insured.
Yes.
So that is
And
where the Indian scene is completely different.
They have the high insurance value.
Yes, yes.
And once it goes to judiciary, then the amount goes to any amount. Right?
Correct,
and
correct.
That amount may be increased to anything. And then when it came to us, we were debating, and perhaps I'm thankful to entire DCGI office, including then DCGI, Dr. Jayan Singh, and all the related officers. And we debated, believe me, we had a couple of meetings, and we said, we want to create something which is, because this is for the first time globally, the compensation was to be decided by a professional body.
Correct. And even
Right?
today, I think that is true, sir.
That is true. So it was a professional body who was deciding compensation. We wanted to be, we wanted to be positive towards the person who has died, the family. Towards society, we were answerable to society, as well as we were answerable to our industry also. We never wanted that industry should have a negative vibrations, because by the time, as Radhika said correctly, the wave of possibility having the trial, I remember 40,000 crore trial will come to India. That was one of the headlines I remember, right? And then we found that due to all these things, the trials dropped down to hardly 5–10%. And then we decided that let us try to. Then we decided to have a base amount. And base amount was decided on the basis of, you see, there was nothing to do with the income of a person, because clinical trial had nothing to do with the income of a person. If you volunteer yourself, whether you are rich or poor, you are involved, right? So it was based upon the wages, the minimum wages or law of our country, and some other formulas were also Motor Compensation Act and all, where it was 4 lakh. And we decided to have the base amount 8 lakhs to be multiplied depending upon, was it a risk factor? It was a high risk factor with very high risk 0.5. It was a risky patient 1, less risky 2, and then healthy patient enrollment 4. So multiplied accordingly, as well as the age factor, and where the age factor we considered 65 year downwards to 60 years. If somebody was 16 years, the multiplication factor was 2.28. Up to 65, where it was 99.737.
75, yeah, 99.75.
Right? So with this formula, we came to a formula, and I'm really lucky enough, and I feel myself proud that I was associated in creating this formula. Why? Because this formula, when it was created, approved by Ministry of Health, implemented, it went to industry, it went to people, it went to society, and we started looking into the applications, all the death, and we started giving compensations. And what I found, that there is a level of satisfaction.
Yes, sir, I do agree, because even when this formula was initially introduced, sponsors were a little skeptical, because I was part of the whole piece. But now I think so more important than the formula, sir, is to say that the expert committee has been very fair and balanced in terms of
and
seeing the causality.
Absolutely, the causality.
That has been the biggest gain out of this.
Dr. Suresh, I always said that there is a big list to assess the causality.
Yeah,
but I always say, and still I want to say, the application of mind. If you go through the things, if you find that application of mind with all the list of whatever is being described, to look into the causality. I mean, it should be a balanced way of looking into causality. And that is what I remain chairman of this committee, and from 2013 to 2016, till I retired from MEMC. And I remember having recommended, because ours was the recommending body, not the approval body. Approval body was DCGI. And hardly there was any challenge. I mean, all were accepted, and perhaps both the segments.
Right, sir.
Industry,
So,
and that was the beginning of compensation, which was accepted
Sir,
by
according to the
society.
compensation formula for a 16-year-old person, the maximum compensation possible is almost 74 lakhs.
Yes.
So, Dr. Kiran Martak, as a CRO, if you have to plan for such a compensation, how did you revise your planning and how did you get the insurance? That's a crucial question, right?
Yeah,
Dr.
Dr. Martak, yeah, regarding, I mean, that was one of the questions that we needed to address in this panel is considering the new compensation formula and the equipoise which the government has proposed, how did, sponsors change their approach in terms of shaping insurance, clinical trial insurance? How was the negotiations with insurance companies, the quantum, the co-pay, the premium, etc.? If you could just summarize, because Dr. Martak, we are unfortunately running behind schedule.
Yeah.
And Purvish bhai is with behind me with the stick, So
Yeah, I'll be very quick. And very rightly mentioned, the compensation was one of the big hurdles. But then the sponsors started acting along with the insurance companies, and they tried to see that ultimately there is some benefit to the patients or the healthy subjects which is given. And as we know that the in the clinical trial there can be either healthy subjects or the patients, and irrespective of that, there can be always a medical management, and there can be a compensation for the SAE. The medical management they started taking along with as a kind of a medical treatment, like they will do to any subject who will get hospitalized, like that kind of medical insurance. But for the SAE, what they started doing is they started taking the insurance along with the product liability. So that is where the changes started coming in, and they considered SAE as a part of product liability, and that is where I think they started getting some leverage out of it. And they also started taking the insurance coverage from the large insurance companies, which are international organizations, so that they can have for a particular product the insurance coverage for multiple countries. Of course, they have to obey the rules and regulations of each country, but that started helping them out because their corporate office will decide about what kind of insurance needs to be taken, and the discussion with the insurance organization. And the advantage of the multinational companies is they have a right kind of people, in the sense that they have the person who looks into the risk assessment, they have underwriters also, they have doctors, they have pharmacists, so they evaluate properly. And also there are regulators even in their people who are dealing with the regulators, that also they are there with them. And what they started doing is that they started with the multiple studies, uh, uh, and they started like an umbrella coverage. Let's say they will say we will have 5 first in human studies, 20 phase 2 studies, 20 phase 3 study. So they started taking umbrella coverage. And in that, what happened was, in somewhere where it was not utilized in one particular study, it was utilized in the other studies.
studies,
So they started doing something like that into the umbrella
bundling, yeah,
coverage.
correct.
Yeah, so bundling of it, and that
Yeah.
is where, and of course the most important was the number of sites, the number of studies, the number of patients, the duration of the studies. And what they also started doing is that there is a spillage of a particular premium, for some reason it was not utilized because of certain conditions, and then it was used in the next financial year.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that is what they started doing.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Martak. I think, from an
Yeah.
MNC multinational perspective, the point that you mentioned, they actually negotiate a kind of a holistic kind of an insurance cover for all countries participating in the study, for all studies, so
Right.
that makes sense for them as well. And finally, when
Right.
we look at clinical trials, a very important stakeholder are most of you sitting and listening to this webinar, the investigators. And to kind of, address the investigator perspective, we have Dr. Sahu, I guess, on the panel.
Yeah,
Dr. Sahu.
I'm there.
Yeah. So could you briefly, sir, kind of summarize for us
Yeah,
as to how the landscape changed for investigators from the 2012, 2013 era to where we are currently?
see, it will be very short that I was in the middle of the storm. I did my trials in the Madhya Pradesh, Bhopal. So that's where the storm really started, the Indore saga. So what I'll tell you what happened in 2013 and 15 is that there was a lot of confusion about trials. We were not sure what exactly the regulator wanted from us. Most of us felt at that time it was a knee-jerk reaction that really happened. And there was a lot of fear because there was a lot of things that was not clear to us. There was in between an interim order that you cannot be a PI in more than 3 trials. That was something very disturbing because a lot of us were already doing more than that number of trials. We didn't know what to do with the existing trials. There was confusion regarding compensation because I being a part of like more than 40 multinational trials, there was always clear that these guidelines were followed already. We used to always look at the causality, but there was nothing written about the compensation in black and white. So once the compensation happened, the issues which we had as a PI was the placebo arm also, it was told that we should compensate them. So we were not sure what's happening in the placebo arm. If something already is not, no standard of care is required, still the patient dies. So should I be all compensated? So that is something that really was a confusion, and this gradually settled down over the period what we are looking at today. Now it is little better. I feel at that time it was even look at your PI once you set up as a center, we had a lot of employees working under us. There's a lot of revenue, loss of revenue because no trials came into us for next 2 to 3 years continuously. So that gradually settled down. Still the fear lurks in the patients, in the community. I think it will take a lot more time than this 5 years. I think next 10 years, 1 decade of good, honest investigatory investigations and other the drug control of India assurances will go a long way. But what I feel that point was more of confusion, more of fear, and that confusion has gradually been taken away. And I think still I would last end up that two judgments initially, with all respect to all those who did it, was more of a knee-jerk reaction from a PI perspective to please the media and whatsoever, rather than do it in an honest way. But gradually the waters does settle. And now we are in a much better way. We are doing it in much better way.
Thank you, Dr. Sahu. Thank you very much. Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, Dr. Martak. And of course, sir, Dr. Agarwal, for sharing your thoughts. I think I'll just close with 1 or 2 lines to say that, we have walked a fair distance from where we were in 2012-13. It's not a perfect world, but I think today stakeholders are playing their part with much more responsibility so that we are able to place, very, very beneficial patient-centric trials in India. So with that, I hand it over back to the, MC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you everyone for the lively discussion. We will take the questions at the end of the session. We'll move on to our next panel discussion. This panel discussion is moderated by Dr. Chirag Desai, PI and CRO, and the panelists are Dr. Ghanshyam Biswas, PI, Dr. Venkat Raman Radhakrishnan, PI, and Dr. Vinit Govind Gupta, PI. Over to you, Chirag, sir.
Thank you very much, Kashish and the organizers. And Dr. Parikh, thank you for involving me in this wonderful discussion. We heard a very useful discussion about the evaluation of compensation guideline. And it seems that now the guidelines are quite evolved. But if you look at from the investigator or ethics committee perspective, I'll try to discuss about what are still the pitfalls remaining and where do we need to improve. And thank you for giving me the excellent galaxy of my panelists who are all PIs for a long time. Dr. Vishwas from Bhubaneswar, Dr. Vinit Gupta from Delhi, and Dr. Venkat Raman from Chennai. I hope all of you are there.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I will start with you, Vishwas. How comfortable are you in dealing with sponsors, ethics committee, and regulatory authorities when the SAE and particularly a death occurs? So tell me how comfortable you are and what are the issues that you are facing in dealing with the sponsors in reporting the SAEs, particularly death.
So I think touchwood, so over last 1 decade or so things have not been so bad. So maybe one instances or two where things so many a times because of your team members so not documenting properly, or things has like something SAEs happened and it is over a weekend, or as a PI I am out of station and it has not been reported, that initial report which is to be in 24 hours. So otherwise the sponsor has really been helpful in regards to the clinical trial. and definitely help and guidance from the ethics committee has been there. So the problem of SAE, so when something has gone beyond at a home place and the patient party has not informed us, so, and secondly, over the weekend or when there is a lacuna from the own team, then there is the minor issues which have been actually held by the sponsors or the audit teams before we really go into that crush situations.
All right, Dr. Vinit, do you have any issues when dealing with these committees in reporting the deaths on the clinical trials in oncology?
Yeah, so frankly, I have not had a lot of problem. The one scenario is that sometimes if the patient, passes away when he is not under our care, for example, it is a outstation patient and they suffer a SAE and the information is not available, that makes it a little difficult in the initial part. But fortunately, in the instance where I have had it, we were able to get the clarifying information later. From the ethics committee or sponsor, we have not had a lot of issues or problem. Maybe the research team at our center has been very cooperative also. So we have had good people to help us with our clinical trials.
Right. And Dr. Venkat, you are working in teaching institute in Chennai, and you are catering to the various strata of the people. And do you get any problem in dealing with the sponsor or ethics committee? Do you get enough information when you are reporting the death to the sponsors or ethics committee?
No, sir. We have not had any problems. We have had an excellent ethics committee, and also the sponsors have been very helpful. According to me, the most important part of all the linking all these things is a very good trial coordinator who will ensure that all the documentation is perfect and it's submitted on time to the EC and the sponsors. So that's a vital link. But so far, it's been very smooth for us, sir.
Right. So Venkat, has it ever happened that the SAE or the that occurred before about 5 or 6 years, and the regulatory authorities comes to you with questions on that off late after 5-6 years?
No, sir, we haven't faced any issues because we have a DSMB as well as an ethics. So we submit all our SAEs to both of them, and we also inform the sponsor, and we keep records of all the documents. So as if your documentation is good and perfect, I don't think so there should be any problem. You should be able to explain everything, sir. We have not had any such issues.
Yeah, sir. So I think so. So more than a year has been quite a common because it takes a long time with the disease. So 1.5 years, 2 years, it has been quite a common thing. So not 5 years, but more than a year has been quite a common.
Right. So Ghanshyam, with you only. Do the regulatory authorities contact you directly, or they contact you through the sponsor?
So they put a mail, and we usually get some information from the sponsors too.
Right. And when they send you the email, are you getting the clear information about what exactly do they require, or there is some gap over here?
Many a times we have sent a repeated mails, and you get after 3 months that we have not received it. We send the same mail back, so it has been quite a common phenomenon with the system.
Right. So that is something that needs to improve, right? We will come to that towards the end of the panel discussion about where are we expected to improve. So with that, let me look at the case scenario that often happens in our country, that patient with metastatic non-small cell lung cancer enrolled on a biosimilar bevacizumab trial with carbon paclitaxel. Patient had a partial response after 4 cycles and continued on maintenance bevacizumab. When contacted a couple of days prior to the maintenance cycle 6, the site came to know that the patient died suddenly at home before about 15 days. So, Vinit, does this type of incidents occur quite often or only occasionally?
Sir, I would say it occurs occasionally. So, I have my research experience is not very long, but I have faced one such incident. So it does happen.
Right. Dr. Venkat, does this type of incidents occur quite often, or it's only occasionally?
I haven't personally faced such a situation. Generally, patients who are in the trials are very well looked after, and they are given the phone numbers of everybody. So even minor ailments, they immediately call us. But I have not faced such a situation in my experience, sir.
Very good. And what about you, Ghanshyam?
No, so I think so. It has been quite often, So I will tell at least in double figures in last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
And in the COVID times, at least 4 such incidents has happened.
Right. So, I have been in the clinical trial since 1995, and ever since I was in GCRI till 1998, I worked with quintiles for a couple of years. And then since 2006, again, I'm back in clinical trials as PI. And these type of incidences are not a rarity. They occur regularly. So, Ghanshyam, since you have the experience of facing this situation, how do you proceed in such cases?
So many a times when you just maybe 2 days prior or 3 days prior, so your team members just reminds, give it a call. So either you see that repeated calls are not being answered, then so you come on the big day, so the patient is not there, and suddenly, so after contacting, you get to know that so 2 weeks back or 3 weeks back or 5 days back, the patient has expired, and then the whole thing. So the idea is, the first thing is to inform the EC, the hospital authority, and the DCGI. So within 24 hours. So what happens when the patient dies in the hospital? And so did you notice? And then you try to collect all the informations that what has happened wrong with the patient.
Right. So, Ghanshyam, according to the current new clinical trial rules, you are supposed to inform the EC and the sponsor and the regulatory authorities within 24 hours of occurrence.
Right.
Right. And if happening, you have to explain. So how do you explain the ethics committee as well as the sponsor and the regulatory authorities that you are informing beyond stipulated time, but then it was because of what reason? How do you explain?
So in such a case, when the SAEs happen outside the premises and when there is no information from the patient side, so the time, so today at 2 p.m. I got an information the patient has died. So 2 p.m. from today till 2 p.m. from tomorrow. So that is 24 hours for in such incidences.
Right. So Venkat, you said that this doesn't happen at your site. I'm happy about that. But if in case that happens, how will you inform the sponsor about the incidents, and what all information you will give in the first instance within first 24 hours?
So, sir, as Dr. Ghanshyam said that I would send an email immediately, even if it's a weekend, informing the sponsor and the ethics committee about the facts of the case, as to, whatever the initial details were, what we had got verbatim from the patient's caregivers or from the hospital where we had seen, and tell them that we would send a detailed report, and this is only a preliminary report, because your facts might change based on further investigations.
Right. So, Vineet, I am happy that this doesn't happen at your site, but occasionally this happens at many sites, that after repeated telephone calls, the family member tells that the patient developed sudden breathlessness. Patient was taken to a nearby hospital. Oxygen was started, IV fluid was given, blood tests were done, ECG was done, and none of the report is available at the time of reporting the event to the various authorities. The breathlessness worsened, patient shifted to ICU, and patient died in about 12 hours of hospitalization. So this is what you know about this case, and how will you compile and how will you inform the various authorities about these incidents?
So, sir, of course, we will. If we are not able to get more information from the family or the hospital, we should. This information need to be transmitted to the authorities, and we can figure out some kind of differential. It could be hemorrhage, disease progression, or pulmonary embolism or something. So it is possibly, since the patient is on trial of Avastin, it is possibly related to the IP. So we would in fact say that there is a possibility that it is IP related at this point, but we can clarify that we are trying to collect the documents and more information.
Right. Ghanshyam, you contact the hospital where the patient was admitted, and are the hospital always willing to give the details to you, or they're reluctant?
So unless and until so once you call up, you give your so what you are dealing with and who are you. So many times there is a hesitancy. So if that is so maybe you have to physically meet them. You take a letter from or request from the hospital head, and then probably you have to need to contact.
Right. So that's wonderful. Vinny already said about compensation that it should be considered possibly related to that, but we will come to that a little later on. The procedure followed for compensation right now. So Vinit, this new drug rules of March 2019, And we already discussed about if the investigator failed to report within 24 hours, we have to furnish the reasons for the delay to the satisfaction of Central Licensing Authority along with the report of the serious adverse events. Now, Central Licensing Authority shall constitute an independent expert committee to examine the cases of days and make recommendation. So this is what happens, and the sponsor or its representative and the investigator shall forward their report on serious adverse event after due analysis. After due analysis, right? So, Vinith, what do you mean by due analysis?
So I think basically what the due analysis means is that we have to give, based on the analysis, based on looking at the reports and the timeline, what we feel is the possible causes of the event, so that they can make a decision. So it in cases where, of course, in scenario like this patient, it could be related or unrelated, so that should be part of the analysis. That we don't know, every case cannot have a yes or no answer.
Right. And we have to report that within 14 days. And do you think the 14 days is sufficient time or it's not sufficient?
No, sir, it is not sufficient in some cases. So it is sufficient in some cases, not in every case.
So, I mean, we have to work fast once we get the event like this. So, Dr. Venkat, so within these 14 days, what all information and how you will try to collect from various sources?
So, sir, as I said, everything, even if you are giving ranitidine or paracetamol, you have to mention what are the drugs which have been given. And the timeline is important: date, time, date, duration, when did the PIC, what time was the drug administered. So it should be a very detailed report, comprehensive report. Right. And you have to clearly tell whether there's a causality or not. Obviously, the ethics report also weighs in, because the DCGA goes by the ethics report as well, but it has to be we sent a very detailed reports for 1 or 2 patients where we had to give a compensation, and we got a lot of queries back as well.
Yeah, so that's the point. Ghanshyam, Venkat said that we get a lot of queries, and what are these queries usually like?
So you can get a queries of why ranitidine was used. So then the whole problem. So there is no mention of gastritis. There is no mention of vomiting. So there can be like such funny questions: why Lezuride was being used, why paracetamol was being used. So,
right. So that's the issue, that we keep on getting what we perceive as unnecessary queries from the sponsor and from the regulatory authorities and from various. So how do you think we can streamline the process of reporting the death and the serious adverse event with most of the queries which are meaningful?
Chirag, can I ask you to wrap up, please?
Yeah, sure.
If you can.
So I think I have utilized how many minutes? I'm not sure, but yeah, okay, I can go fast. The expert committee is getting the recommendation from various sources, from the sponsor, from the investigator, and they will sit on it, and within 60 days, they will send a report. And they will also look at the amount of compensation. So ultimately, the Central Licensing Authority has to decide on that. So Ghanshyam, when you had to give the compensation, does it always come from the Central Licensing Authority, or it is thrown upon your ethics committee?
So from my side, so I have 4 compensation. So amount, the highest has been 6.5 lakhs rupees, and all it does come from the central licensing, so not from the ethics committee.
Okay. In my experience, many a times the Central Licensing Authority was passing the buck to the ethics committee, and they kept on insisting the ethics committee to determine the causality and to determine the amount of compensation. That was, of course, in about 2016 or 2017, not off late. But ethics committee and the investigators are being given a lot of responsibility, and I think we have to evolve from there. I think study code. Okay, coming back to this case, the study coordinator asked the name of the telephone number of the hospital. The hospital was not willing to give the details. The PI called the hospital, as some of you said, the doctor in charge, and explains the need of documenting what all happened. And the doctors are usually afraid of litigation when they listen about clinical trials. But the persistence by explaining the hospital, we can get most of the details. In this particular case, as Vinith said, that patient had sudden dyspnea, and the only possible reason in our case is pulmonary embolism, which is a known side effect of bevacizumab. And in this case, the patient needs to be compensated. So I hope all of you agree. And maybe all of you can have a final comment and then we can close this session. Starting from you, Ghanshyam.
So at least in 2002, I was with Purvish on the bevacizumab Avastin trial, and today we have another bevacizumab trial. So I won't consider that 2% or 4% of event which can cause death. Rather, I will put it as a disease progression if this patient has not been evaluated.
No, okay. My question is, how do you want the process of causality assessment and the compensation calculation get better in coming years? So that comment I want from all the panelists, and then we want to close. Ghanshyam.
Sir.
Yeah, so how do you want the process to improve?
So
what are your suggestions?
Once there is a death happening, so first you need to be sure that you in the hospital and the research team is first that there is no litigation comes to you. Secondly, if the patient and the patient kins can be benefited, and then we take all the help. And third is so proper documentation, proper adequate help from the ethics committee and the sponsors, and then going back to the central committee and reporting it. That's the importance.
Vinith, what are your suggestions to improve the processes?
Sir, I think it is a good idea to document even mild adverse events very well for trial patients. So often what we do while documenting, we fail to document grade 1 toxicity. So I think it might help if our documentation with each visit is for even mild toxicity, they are documented very well, so that it helps to see the course of the patient in case of serious toxicity occurs. That's what I feel.
Dr. Venki?
Sir, I would say the ethics committee is very important. All such cases should be discussed thoroughly in the ethics committee by all members. Minutes should be documented to determine the causality rather than just one individual. And we should always err on the side of, benefiting the patient. So I think the ethics is very key in this process, sir.
Wonderful. So beyond that, what I feel is important is that when there is the due analysis, when there is due diligence on the part of regulators as well as the expert committee constituted by the regulator, that needs to be a conference call between the investigator, the ethics committee, the sponsors medical person, the expert committee, and someone from the regulatory authority. And in that con call, which may go on for about half an hour, 1 hour, 1.5 hours, the causality and compensation and calculation, everything should be completed so that there is no back and forth of the queries and the process can be streamlined. With that, I end here and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you to all the panelists for the wonderful session. We'll move on to the next panel discussion. Our next session is moderated by Dr. Hemant Malhotra, member DCGI SAE committee, and the panelists are Dr. Arun Agarwal, Dr. Raju Titus Chako, member, Dr. Nilesh Lokeshwar, member of the ECTMH, Dr. Aditi Parikh, Medical Department of Pharma Company and CRO, and Dr. Shailesh Bondade, PI. Over to you, Hemant sir.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here. And in the next 20 odd minutes, we will thrash out some compensations, how to calculate a little more. And my very expert panelists, Dr. Arun Agarwal, Dr. Raju Chako, Dr. Nilesh Lokeshwar, Dr. Shailesh Bondade, and Dr. Aditi Parikh. Dr. Agarwal is the regulator, and I remember in May of 2013, when the first meeting, how to decide calculations, was held along with Dr. Y.K. Gupta. They led the meeting and, they first formulated this compensation formula, which we are dealing with now. Raju Chako is on one of the DCGI committees with me. We had a meeting in the morning today. Also a very avid trialist. Nilesh Lokeshwar, again, PI of standing and also member of the ethics committee of the TMH in Bombay. Shailesh Bondade, very active principal investigator. He has a very large number of trials under his belt. Dr. Aditi Parikh used to represent Roche. Now she's with a major CRO. So we have a nice mix of regulators, principal investigators, with somebody representing the CROs. So my greetings to you from my institution and thanks for this opportunity. I'd like to make a disclaimer that some of the issues discussed and views expressed will entirely be mine and no implications on my panelists or my institutional review board or on the DCGI. So some take-home messages might be mine for disclaimer. So just to put everything into perspective, what people have been talking about, we had an era of advantage India in the 1990s and the first decade of the 20th century. And these reasons why India was such a hugely popular destination. Then the bubble burst in the second decade of this century because of isolated cases of allegedly incorrect conducted trials, unbalanced and possibly one-sided media reporting. Debate went from the public to the parliament. PILs were filed by several NGOs in the Supreme Court. And this resulted in sharp drop in clinical trials numbers, 500 plus trials in 2010 to about 100 trials in 2013, and even lower in the years after this. This also led to a decrease in number of new drug approvals for marketing in India, 200 plus in 2010 to just about 35 in 2013. And then a PIL was filed in the Supreme Court. Main concerns raised were process of informed consents and compensation given to trial participants related to injury or death. And then finally, affidavits were filed by the government of India to the Supreme Court. And in this affidavit, the government stated that between 2005 and 12, there were 2,800 plus clinical trial participants who had died. And only 89 of these were related to trials. Compensation was paid to 86. 3, the kin could not be traced. Compensation amount ranged from 55,000 to 42 lakhs. And the amount of compensation was decided quite in an inobjective fashion because there were no guidelines at that time. And this was on the best judgment of ethics committees, sponsors, or investigators. So let me come to my panelists now. Let me ask the PIs first, and let me ask our senior most PI, Dr. Suresh Bondade. So what was good in the trials in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and what was bad? Very quick, crisp answer, Suresh.
Sir, I have been in trials from 2006 onwards. So I think 2006 onwards, obviously there were a lot of trials, a lot of patients who were actually willing to participate in trial. And what happened after the PIL was everybody, even the media and the patient, started looking at it in a negative way. So consenting the patient was also an issue once the PIL was filed and in 2013 onwards. With few issues which came up after 2013, already discussed by Dr. TP Sahu, in which the number of sponsors reduced drastically, the number of patients who wanted to, whom we thought would benefit, didn't consent for the trial. AV consenting was there. There was issue in AV consenting, how to do it, who has to do it, how long to keep the records. Then there was few issues regarding the accreditation of the ECs. There were few things which were discussed, like all ECs should be accredited under NABH, and was that really feasible? The cost of accrediting the ECs, that was again something which needs to be discussed. But I think 2019 regulations have really put things in a proper way. And at least I am very happy that most of the regulations are accepted by the sponsors, and even the patients have now started understanding that participating in a trial is not something that we are trying the drugs, like they feel that they used to feel that we are trying some new drugs with no scientific background. Okay. So if you give a good proper consent, I think explain them properly, then
can I ask Dr. Chako to come in? Raju, in those days when you and I were young, fresh medical oncologists, I'm not saying that you're not young, I'm not young. In this last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, what was bad in the large number of trials being done at that time? Very quick, crisp answer.
So I would say that the issues were largely that, patients were sometimes taken for a ride. There was a lot of bad press there, and patients were very suspicious at that point when the press became bad. Till then, they were very, very supportive and wanted us and wanted the drugs because it was free, and that was the main reason why people took on trials. Okay, and that particularly was bad. The consent was bad. Those were the things that really mattered at that time.
Yeah, so I think, after all this, the Supreme Court cracked the whip on the government, and in 2013, these three very landmark amendments related to clinical trial injury, related to conduct of clinical trials, and related to registration of ethics committees were issued. And compensation became a huge issue in clinical trials. It became the most important issue in clinical trials. And then also the definition of clinical trial related injury or death was released by our regulators in 2014. And you can see this definition very clearly, the points which were raised: adverse effects because of IP, violation of protocol, failure of IP to produce intended therapeutic use, use of placebo and placebo-controlled trials, adverse effects of conmeds, injury to the child in utero, and any clinical trial procedure involved in the study which could lead to an injury. So let me ask Dr. Aditi now. Aditi, from a sponsor perspective, these definitions of clinical trial injury, were you happy with them? This is going back into the past, or were you satisfied with them? Dr. Aditi?
Yes, sir. First of all, thanks to Purvish sir for inviting me for this discussion. Hemant sir, yes, there were clinical trial injury definitions published in 2014. And these definitions, more or less, if you notice in the new drug CT rules of 2019, on a larger aspect, they remain the same, sir. And there are not much changes. There was a lot of due deliberation done with respect to coming up with these particular clinical trial definitions. However, there were certain things, which were kind of, questionable, where when you do a clinical trial and then you try and say that if there's a failure of investigation product to provide the intended therapeutic effect, then, the patient should be compensated, or that's a clinical trial injury or death. And use of placebo and placebo-controlled trial. I mean, these sentences, the intent we understand because we've been working with the regulators to understand the intent and get the right wording out. However, this made to be seem like an abrupt statement. And considering the participation of India in global clinical trials and doing innovative clinical research in India, this had a huge impact. But thankfully so, we worked with the regulators very engaging, and certain things were added, to supplement these sentences. That if the standard of care, if it is available and not provided, that kind of thing, Hemant sir really helped us. And those corrections have been made in due course in the clinical trial regulations. And that balancing effect has occurred, sir.
Right. So a lot of debate and, a lot of noise was made on these 2 points. Like the very reason why you do a clinical trial is to find out whether the IP is working or not. So you cannot guarantee that the IP is going to work. And again, there was a lot of hue and cry with placebo-controlled trials. Finally, an amendment was issued to these points, and it was, clarified, which made it more realistic. And then now let's come to compensation. In India, we follow the philosophy of no-fault compensation. And this means that every injured participant gets compensated, even if the injury was anticipated, expected, even if though it was fully explained to the patient during the informed consent process. The patient or the patient's kin does not have to go to the court and prove that something wrong has been done to claim compensation. And if you compare it to the rest of the world, some European countries, a similar no-fault basis applies. But the compensation formula in these countries is not very clear as it is now in our country. While in the US, the torts law applies, means that if you want compensation, then you have to go to the court and prove that something, either the researcher was at fault, or the research project was at fault, or the product or the drug was at fault. A similar problem exists in China. So now my question to Dr. Arun Agarwal, like the architect of this compensation formula in our country. Dr. Agarwal, sir, do you believe that the no-fault compensation is the right way forward in our country? A quick, crisp answer from you, sir.
Thank you, Hemant. It's nice meeting you after such a long time.
Right,
Thanks to organizer of this seminar, webinar that we are meeting. Great meeting you. Of course, that was one of the important factor of hue and cry. As you yourself very nicely mentioned about total compensations given from 2005 to 2012, right? And which was between 55,000 to few lakhs rupees. But one of the important recommendations and which satisfied the society and perhaps professional people like us also, as well as the industry, that now there is a structured formula. And you were initially, you were the part of this, where we considered very balanced mechanism. Right? We had all the discussion, what is happening in European countries, what is happening in the US, and what we can do best possible in our Indian scenario. Knowing fully well, you remember there was a lot of discussion, income-based and this and that. We ruled it out. No one said before in the first panel that the outcome is satisfactory because, in my opinion, of course, when it started, for many of us, it was a knee-jerk reaction. But maybe that when few regulations, as you correctly said, the regulators gave a list of A to G component, which will consider the causality factors. And I knew it that in that there are 2 or 3 important factors which is perhaps not clear to us. And that ultimately, whenever something new starts as a knee-jerk reaction, then an expert like all of you sat together. And if you correctly, whatever was released in 2013, there was one mention there, the entire thing will be reviewed after 5 years. Even the base amount was to be reviewed after 5 years.
Right, sir. And I very fondly remember Dr. Ranjit Rai Chaudhary, the late Dr. Ranjit Rai Chaudhary, who was instrumental in getting these corrections.
As I already acknowledged.
Yes,
So
sir.
that is why ICMR in 2019 March document compensated for all those things which were initially perhaps not to our like or dislike, but now we are having a balanced mechanism of base amount, age factor. The younger person should get more, higher the risk should get, and low risk should get more. All these things are very important. And still I feel that my industry in India seems to be satisfied, and I feel there is no reason that otherwise they perhaps the Supreme Court or society would have gone in a different way. So we, with this formula, we have brought a balance, and things are moving comfortably now.
Correct, correct. So this is the well-publicized formula. All of you are aware of this. This is the best fit formula, which we came up in our meeting in June 2013 with Dr. Agarwal, hosted at Maulana Azad. And I remember Dr. Y.K. Gupta, leading this and thrashing it, everything around. And this risk factor, this division factor, I mean, I can credit myself for this. I made a lot of noise about this, particularly in connection to oncology trials. And I may also let the cat out of the bag a little with Dr. Agarwal's permission, that we admitted a basic amount, the base amount as 4 lakhs, but somewhere down the line it got changed.
Motor Compensation Act.
Yeah. So I have a
That
question now to Dr. Nilesh. Dr. Nilesh, like when you're talking about a compensation of minimum 2 lakhs and a maximum of 74 lakhs, do you think that amount of inducement to a potential patient or his family with this very large amounts of compensation comes into play, and that is one of the reasons why this reimbursement amount or compensation amount should not be out of proportion? Dr. Nilesh?
So there are a couple of things we need to keep this in mind. One is we are talking about clinical trials in general and not specific to oncology.
Right.
Second is while it is clearly mentioned in the ICF, and it should be mentioned that patients will be compensated in such an event, these amounts are something that are calculated much later in the event of such a causality. So while inducement is a concern and should be kept in consideration, it should be in no way obstructing our ability to give justice to the patient who has lost his life or had a event resulting from a clinical trial.
Very well said. So our primary concern should be the safety of the patient. So I think in the interest of time, we can talk about this later. Just a couple of case vignettes. Purvish, how much time do I have?
Actually, it's 2 minutes now.
Okay, so I think I will pass this case. I will go to this case. So no, this case. So now we're talking about a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study of sustained release erythropoietin in patients of non-small cell lung cancer who become anemic post-chemotherapy. And now we have this case, 59 years old, squamous cell carcinoma, stage 4, consented, recruited in the trial, started on 3-weekly paclitaxel carboplatin and IP/placebo because this is a double-blind trial. So 2 weeks after the 3rd cycle of chemo, the patient died at his home. So very, this, as Dr. Chirag brought out this point, and this is not an unusual occurrence, at least in B category cities like Ahmedabad and Jaipur and Bhubaneswar, as Ghanshyam also mentioned. So we did a detailed telephonic interrogation of the patient's son, and we could dig out that the patient had significant dyspnea a few days before the death, but no medical help was sought, no X-ray was done, no ECG was done. The casualty assessment of the cause of death, PI thought it was not related to IP. Sponsor also thought not related to IP, and sponsor usually do think like this. But the EC did keep the possibility that it could be related to IP, and our committee, we were on this committee with the DCGI formed, which looked at grade 5 SAEs, and some of us used to call it the death committee. And we looked at almost 1,000 retrospective files, such thick files to patients who had died on clinical trials and not been compensated. So our committee thought that this could be related to the IP, possibly pulmonary thromboembolism. Now the problem with this study was this was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and we didn't know whether the patient was on darbepoetin or not. The DCGI committee requested the EC to request the sponsor to break the code and provide us information whether the patient was on IP or not. The sponsor, international sponsor, this was an international trial, refused on scientific ground, saying that the breaking the code will dilute their scientific content. We said, okay, fine, don't tell us. We will presume that the patient was on the darbepoetin, and that is well known to produce deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism. And there is reasonable ground that this patient might have had pulmonary embolism, which could be related to the investigational product, and he should be compensated. And the sponsor paid the compensation. 4 lakhs, a check of 4 lakhs rupees was given to this patient's son. Now, my question to the panelists, to Dr. Raju Chako, who is both a PI as well as a regulator, is it reasonable for the review board or the regulator or the PI to request the sponsor in a situation like this to break the blinding code? Dr. Chako.
I think it's quite okay for them to do so. See, the PI himself can request for the sponsor to break the code, especially when it's an issue of patient safety. Okay, now here the patient has died, but let us say that the patient was in front of you and had a pulmonary embolism, and you wanted to know whether this patient was a darbepoetin, if there was no other cause that you could figure for the pulmonary embolism, then, requesting the patient, the sponsor to break the code was completely okay and ethical.
Correct. Okay, so this is what happened in this patient, and this is the situation which you might come across once in a while. So, Dr. Aditi, as a CRO, would be or a representative or a of the industry, like a representative of the sponsor doing a big international trial, would you be comfortable in breaking the code, or would you let the regulators and the PI and the ethics committee presume that, okay, fine, you can go ahead and compensate, take the default setting as the patient was on the PI? Dr. Aditi, very quick answer on why.
Yes, sir. Yes, Hemant, sir. So I think if I have to think in a pragmatic manner, I would probably say that it's absolutely fine to break the code as long as the sponsor or CRO is getting it done through a third party, and where the core study team still remains blinded from a scientific lens and, from a non-biased lens. And if that's the case, and if there is a team which is, carved out to break the blind and share, especially what Chako sir said with respect to if the patient had not died, then there is no question of not breaking the blind.
100% agreed. All of us are aware of that. The PI can and should break the code, and the sponsor can and should break the code in that situation. So, okay, this is one of the interesting thing. This actually happened at my site, so that's why I'm kind of highlighting this. So this is my last slide. I want to not delay the program anymore. My stay-at-home messages: clinical trials are essential for progress in medicine. Safety of trial subjects of utmost importance. Even more important for our subjects in India, who are relatively less informed as compared to their counterparts in the developed world. An optimal compensation for clinical trial injury death is always difficult to determine, and there will always be, some this is not correct and this is correct debates. Delicate balance between inherent risk in the scientific pursuit of the patient's benefit and safety versus the virtue of participating in the clinical trials. Some little bit of tightrope walking needs to be done over here. And as Dr. Agarwal very clearly mentioned, regulatory guidelines are part of a dynamic process and will continue to evolve as per the changing requirement and demands of the system and the society. So with that, I'd like to wind up. Thank each and every one of my wonderful panelists for an insightful discussion, and Dr. Parikh for organizing this really, really important webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hemant.
Thank you so much, Hemant sir, for making this session an interactive one. We'll move on to our next panel discussion. This is being moderated by Dr. Hitesh Bhatt, medical legal expert, and the panelists are Dr. Shailesh Bondade, PI, and Dr. Satish Bhatt, medical legal expert. Over to you. Over to you, Hitesh sir.
Okay, so thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I will start the panel right away. Okay, I hope the slides are visible to you. So I welcome you all the viewers, and good evening to all of you. Straight to the question, what is negligence? Can any of the panelists say in few words, what is negligence? Hello.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes, sir.
Yeah. I would put it, negligence is a misconduct, or you can say improper treatment, non-scientific treatment to the patient.
Right. So in short, the legal definition of negligence is to do something which a prudent man in similar situation will not do, or not to do something which a prudent man in similar situation will do. So there is act of commission and act of omission that makes a person negligent. Right. So the center of this definition is a prudent person. How the prudent person would have acted in that particular situation. That makes negligence on the part of the person who is in question. So that is about negligence. I'm just giving this definition for the overview so that we can understand what we are going to discuss further. Now, what is tort? We have laws related to tort. So what is tort? If you are not sure, I will tell you the tort is it is basically a wrongdoing. And when your wrongdoings is affecting somebody's right, then that becomes a tort. So more or less that also negligence is a part of tort. Now, what are the remedies if you are, say, facing any case of negligence, or you are facing a case in the civil court for tort or wrongdoing? What can save you? Like in case of clinical trial, if something goes wrong and the case is in the court, what will save you? What is the most important document that will save you?
I think there are two important documents. One of them is the ICF. The way you have written down the ICF, or the way you have conducted the AV recording of the ICF. And of course, the day-to-day, the clinical notes which you have put on the paper. Recording of everything in black and white is a must.
Right. So that leads us to our third question, that what are the essential part of the consent or the contract for the trial of the drugs? What important thing would you like to include in this particular consent, because that will act as a contract in case of the dispute? So what all should be included apart from the name, age, sex and all? What important thing should be there in a consent?
So the first thing is what type of trial is it? I mean, is it an open label trial, or is it a blinded trial? Is it a double blind trial? What is the particular indication? What is the standard of care as of today? What are the research part of it which we are going to study? Is it compared to the standard, or is it a completely a new drug? Is it already available in the market? What are the potential toxicities? How long the trial is going to go? What are the investigations the patient is likely to undergo? What are the visits the patient has to make? What are the rights of the patient? What the patient has to follow? I think all this plus the toxicity profile of the drug, everything the patient should understand and should follow.
Also, and it is there in in this new drug guidelines of 2019, there is the list of tables given in the table 3. And so we have to include all these tables, but over and above, this is the representative list in any law. When the say in ICMR ART practice, they have given the tables or the headings which should be there in a contract, but that doesn't restrict you from putting more from your side. So more you include, more you are safe. So they have also mentioned that what are the risks involved and what will be the probable treatment you are going to give. So you have to enlist the probable risk of that particular drug, giving that drug and not giving that drug. Because if your patient is on placebo, then you are not going to give that drug. So what are the probable risks that patient is going to face, and what will be the immediate treatment for that? That you have to mention, and that will save you in case of any negligence claim, because if you are acting as per the methods or treatment mentioned in that particular thing, then you are not liable for negligence, because you are clearly telling the patient that if you will suffer this, this will be the treatment I will give 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you follow that 1, 2, 3, 4, then you are not negligent. And that you have to document that you have actually acted. That will be your case paper. So consent is very much important. Now, second thing which I am seeing here, as in this case, the previous case which was discussed by the previous moderator, and he said that the code was not break because the patient died and patient was on this blind control study. Now, in that case, this also can be put in the consent or a contract, that in such eventuality, the codes will be broken by the investigator or the researcher. So that type of clause can be put into this contract or the consent, and that will save the patient's side as well.
But that is okay if it is done before. I mean, once the death has occurred.
Consent is always before.
No. The unblinding of the code.
Yeah, that was not done in that case. Yes,
correct.
But in this particular case, what I'm telling you is in such eventuality, you can put it in black and white so that you can put pressure on the researcher that, see, this is there in the contract and you have to follow this. One more thing which I will come to that after this question, but that will form a part of contract or consent, and that is this. And this question is this amendment speaks about the formula of compensation of the volunteer. Now we already have seen the comments, but what we have seen in this was whether it is correct according to you or not, or is it a good step, or whether what is your idea about this, or what is your comment on this about the compensation?
I think
I would like to know from
yeah.
the panelists first.
Yeah, I think the compensation formula which is there for a person who is where there is a death, where there is a disability, where there is loss of wages. I think this is this looks very standard, and what Dr. Agarwal mentioned is they have kept it as a standard for everybody who is poor or who is rich, doesn't matter, because finally it is a voluntary consent of a person to participate in the study. So your income doesn't matter. So I think it looks standard, and people have accepted it as of now.
Fine. So that is a good step according to all of you. But
there might be some issues. There might be some issues, especially with the daily wages. Everything is taken as per the Delhi standards. I mean, it may be different at different states. When I was checking, it is different at different states. In Maharashtra, it is 10,000 per month. In Delhi, it is 15,000 per month. So 500 rupees per day. So it depends. There might be a variability.
According to the legal, what I can see, this is it is, I think, beyond the scope of the Drug Act. Like the Drug Act cannot decide about the formula. It is basically a matter of court, and court has to decide, or court has to follow this formula. Like in insurance companies, when it comes to insurance has a formula, because Insurance Act basically is an act which basically has to form the laws for the compensation. While for the Drug Act, it is beyond their scope. Like in PCP and DT Act, they have given what course or the study material, what a person has to study. Like in PCP and there was a case filed in the Delhi High Court challenging that particular amendment of 2014 of PCP and DT Act, whether this committee has a right to formulate something about the course. It is basically a business of MCI. MCI can formulate the course and not the PCP and DT Act committee. Similarly, the Drug Act can decide. This is a question of law. This is, but we are not going into the detail because it is already done and it is already formulated. The second question is, can a victim or volunteer ask anything over and above the compensation received? That is the main question, because they have made the formula. But have they written that over and above this, will the person will not have any right to get anything more, a penny more than this formula or than this compensation? So at least that line is not there in that.
Correct. So at least what it mentions is this will be all above the treatment required as well. So whatever the treatment is required will be given, and above all the compensation is added to that. So whether somebody can ask above that, and somebody can go to the court and ask
exactly.
That, so I think it is not there. That is something which is not there.
So that is what is lacking, and that is what I say, that if it had been put in the law that over and above this, the subjects will not be entitled to any other compensation in any other court of India or anywhere in the world, then that would have restricted them. The way this the formators of the law have made compensation, though beyond their scope of making the law, they should have added this line as well. But we can do this in the contract, though it is not legally valid, but still it will morally bind the patient. You have to write in the consent. I'm coming back to the previous slide. That
so I think that's a very important point which you are saying.
Yes, and that we have to put, and that is what is something called out of court settlement we are doing, and we are making patient right that I'm accepting this compensation and I will not go to any court. It is said in the Indian Contract Act that any contract which restricts person's fundamental right is void ab initio. Right to justice is a fundamental right. You cannot definitely restrict it. Putting that may not serve your purpose, but at least it will morally bind the patient. And you can always say, and court also may look at it with some sympathy towards the researcher, that he has already paid this much. Now the volunteer should not come and he may not admit the case. So at least put this line in your consent that over and above, the company shall not provide any compensation beyond this thing. But this word should have been there in the 2019 amendment. That is what was my objection or my suggestion for that amendment. If so it had been into the law, it would have been followed, and no court would have taken cognizance of this type of claims.
So actually, I was thinking that it doesn't give any right to the patient, but actually it's an open-end sentence. It gives too much of rights to the patient.
It gives right to the patient. This gives right to the patient to go to, because this is a no fault. I will give you one example. Why it gives right to the patient, I'll tell you. The negligence is altogether different. This is no fault compensation. Even if patient dies, you are giving compensation. But if it is mentioned that this drug is to be given intrathecal and given intravenous, there is definitely a negligence. If the drug has to be given at 8 hours interval and it is given at 7 hours interval, there is definitely a negligence. You can prove it. If it is not documented, then also it is a negligence. And patient is entitled to get more. What you are getting here is a way of compensation. It is not by way of winning by proving your wrongdoing or your tort to the other party. It is like saying TL, suppose patient is undergoing family planning operation. The government of India is paying up to 2 lakh rupees, the one who dies. But still that patient reserves right to sue a doctor if there is negligence in doing family planning operation. So this point should have been, because the compensation amount which comes after this formula is very high than any the previous formulas. So there should have been some capping. Now we are coming to the new Consumer Protection Act and the provisions. We are not discussing much of Consumer Protection Act, but I will summarize this, because the new provision says that the person can, what are the changes? The first thing is the pecuniary limitation which was there with the district forum, the state commission and national forum, that has now gone. And it says that when the charges are taken are not more than 1 crore rupees, the person can file a case with the district forum. Whatever is the amount of compensation he has asked. He can ask even 100 crore, 1000 crore, 2000 crore. But the district commission will decide that case. Previously, it was up to 20 lakhs. So the same judges will decide now cases up to thousands of crores. That is first change they have brought in. And second thing, the victim can file a case or the consumer can file a case in his place of residence or office. So if you are treating a patient in Delhi from Kerala, he can file case in Kerala and doctor will have to fly there to defend himself. So these are the two important provisions of the Consumer Protection Act which makes it draconian. Now, can a subject of clinical trial be labeled as a consumer? That is the third, that is most important question. Can he be labeled as a consumer? I want to know the view of the panelist on this.
I think it's possible.
Going by the prevailing situation, the sentiments will it will be with the person who is volunteered for a drug trial.
You are right. The court may take the case, but I will definitely, as a lawyer, I can make one argument here. What is consumer? The definition of consumer is who has hired the services or purchased the goods for the amount paid, or partly paid and partly promised, or he has promised fully. Now here in this case, no subject is paying you, no subject is partly promising and partly paying you, and no subject is at least in future promising you to pay anything. So subject is not paying, and 100% of the subjects are treated like that. And especially the healthy volunteers, rather they are paid instead of they being paying to the hospital for the trial. So I don't think they fit into the definition of the consumer as far as these trials are concerned. And that can be the argument if they file case in the consumer court. This I'm giving my tricks of the trade on this forum, that this can be the argument which we can put forward, whether they are consumer or not, as far as the consumer law is concerned. But will that prevent you from going to a civil court?
So I just have a question. So if you have a patient and if you have not charged the patient and the patient dies because maybe whatever it is, negligence or what, can the patient sue you?
Yes. They say in the,
but you have not charged anything.
No,
you have
I'm
not
telling you.
Now the patient doesn't become a consumer.
No, I'm telling you why. When it comes to a patient, the consumer court is very clear. They have said that out of 1,000 patients or 100 patients, if one patient is paying you, that will be considered as all 99 have paid you, and you have to consider all 100 as your client, right? That is the standard position in the consumer law.
Now the same doesn't hold for a trial patient.
Why so? Because here patient do not have any intention to pay. You understand that there is a basic difference. There the patient has not paid you, but patient had or patient was supposed to pay you, right? Patient was supposed to pay you. Here the patient there is no contractual there is no contractual binding between you and the patient. That patient is, you are paying rather to the subject, not the patient is paying you. It's a reverse payment. So that is why it doesn't make them a consumer or or your client as far as the consumer law is concerned.
Dr. Hitesh, how does this compare to the situation where the question commonly asked: does a patient who takes treatment in a government hospital and he does
Correct.
not?
I was going to come to that.
So
right.
How would you compare this situation to the one that you?
I will tell you that. See, in that case also, the logic they have given is they are in way paying by the taxes they are paying, and the government doctors are getting the salary. So they are paying indirectly to the government doctors, and that is why the government hospitals are within the ambit of the consumer law. Right? While here in this case, first we have to prove and I am not sure this argument will stand, but at least it will delay your case. The person will have to go to the Supreme Court to file to establish that the subjects are the consumers and not within the ambit of the consumer. So this is a question of law, and that can be taken to the Supreme Court. This is my logic. I put it after the Purvish sir gave me this topic, but this is a very good argument, and I discussed with my lawyer friends as well, and they are all convinced that this argument can be put forward except the patients you are already treating and you are taking them as a subject now. They are still a client. They are still coming to you as a patient. That is altogether a different situation, right? There you are already within their with them in the contract as a doctor and patient, right? But here it is guided by the contract or a consent for the trial, wherein you are paying them. They don't have any intention to pay you, so they will not become your consumer. That is what is my assumption and my argument. But will that stop them from going to the civil court? Because this contract or this consent which you are taking becomes a contract. It is a personal contract between the researcher and the subject, and that can be tried into the civil court. And that is what consumer law says. The consumer definition says the personal contracts are not entertained into the consumer law, right? If I have a contract with my contractor for making a building, or anybody, say for purchasing a car, this is a contract between the dealer and me as a purchaser. It is a personal contract, and it is not triable under this consumer. It is if it is a personal contract, that will the civil court can usually take care of such contracts, the personal contracts. Now, in the personal contract, the same argument will stand about the negligence and about the documentation. And that is why I asked the definition of negligence. Now, what will save you in the civil court? Your diligence. You have to prove that whatever was possible that you have done. One more clause which you could have put in the contract, that this will not allow patient to go to any other court or resort to any other, and let them prove that this is still binding to them. Otherwise, it is breach of the condition from their side. So that line also will help you in such cases in the civil court. But in civil court, they can definitely get the recourse over and above the compensation paid to them. But sir, you were not there, I think, during that first question, that if compensation is paid to the person, will that prevent them from going to the court?
No, it wouldn't. Yeah, I'm sure they can, approach multiple forums, as you all know. There is one more incident I'd just like to share, which is in the context of when a trial is done for a vaccine, as in the current pandemic. So I think recently the health minister of Haryana, he had very publicly volunteered to be a trial for one of the vaccines, and about a week after that, it was reported that he tested positive. So two comments. One is the consent form in case of a consent. In case of a trial for a vaccine, makes a mention that even if the person has taken has been given the active ingredient and not just the placebo, he can still, develop the illness in the.
Sir, yes, and that is in 2019. In 2019 drug rules, it is mentioned as the injury to the patient. They have mentioned that it is adverse effect, not having effect of the drug or failure to have effect, that we discussed in the previous talk, this thing as well. That also I wanted to highlight. Now that is what the trial is for. In how many patients the drug works, that is what the trial is for. It will definitely not work in some of the patients, and that is the risk that patient is taking. So that should not have been added into that, and especially for the vaccines, when it may prevent, it may not prevent. But if you take it, consider it as an injury, the person will get the benefit. And you can't prove that the disease, and that doesn't give him also a right to move without the mask and all. He might have contracted this disease for anywhere from because of his negligence as well. The drug has not acted fine, but he also acted negligently. There is a contributory negligence from his side as well. So
there is the element of defamation also, because there were people making allegations that the vaccine has not worked. With just a one week after the, or 10 days after the, he became a subject to that. So obviously that is, highly inadequate time for the, even if it is working, to take effect. So
right. So that leads us to this question, that what is defamation? And the defamation in India, we have to understand, in India, defamation case can be filed in a civil court as well as the criminal court. This is very important distinction from the Western world. We have defamation that can be filed under civil as well as criminal both. And the Indian Penal Code says whoever by words, either spoken or intended to be read or by sign, publishes something to impute or to cause harm to the reputation of a person, that is called defamation. So that needs to be published. That is most important thing. And we have to understand the difference between these two things. One is, just a minute. The one is, okay, where is my presentation? These two words, and the one is the libel and the slander. What is the difference between slander and libel? The slander is the spoken word. Libel is the printed word. That is what is defamation. And this is section 499. So it has to be published. If somebody publishes something, definitely one can file a case of defamation. And the company can put a defamation case against the person for crores of rupees. Now, where you can complain about the defamation. If you want to put defamation claim against somebody, where all you can complain? You have to, either you can go to a magistrate. The magistrate will have to take cognizance. The district magistrate, he will take the cognizance in a criminal case, and in civil case, you can directly go to the civil court. So these are the remedies for that. And we have to do this. The company, we have seen that incidents that company has sued that person for 100 crore rupees. Even Arun Jaitley did the same thing for the Chief Minister of Delhi. So that happens. We are not taking our pride as our respect worth that much rupees as a doctor. And that is why we don't put defamatory claims on the patient. But at present also, I am handling one case of defamation against the patient. They have used defamatory words in their pleading. You understand, if somebody puts defamatory words in their pleading also, which is not relevant to the case, then also you can file a defamation. And we have filed criminal defamation against the patient. We said to him that you remain restricted to the losses you have incurred or the problems you have suffered. But you can't put defamatory words against the doctor that the Padma Shri award you have got was given by, you have begged it by giving bribe to the officers and all. That word should not be there in the pleading. So we have filed criminal defamation, and there will be final hearing in few days. And the judge, the court is in our favor. So that will help, and that will put pressure on the person. And they have come to compromise in a civil case, which they have filed in the consumer court. They said, we are taking this case back, you take this case back. So that type of compromises are also possible. So we have to do this. So that I wanted to give as a message. So that ends the panel here. And I would like you to say some few words or some words of wisdom to all the viewers. One line from each of you.
Well, for me, I think the last slide was a new learning about defamation, and especially something that is said in an unreasonable manner in any of the arguments regarding the primary problem. We in turn should actually be aggressive and take up that one point, because typically in multiple cases where I have tried to help and coordinate with our colleagues, the legal notice or the submissions done in the Consumer Forum Commission. So there is something that is really, highly unacceptable. And in fact, these are the reasons that hurt our doctor colleagues the most. So many years I've done so much, and after all that, I had to listen to this. So that is actually the effect that the defamatory lines have on the doctor. So at least few of us who coordinate and help our colleagues, I think, should keep in mind that this one point should be used as a, if I may say, as a counter weapon or a counter attack to file a separate case. And if nothing,
I will tell you to the extent the patient went to this sessions court. Usually these courts run into the courts of judicial magistrate. He went to sessions court to get it quashed, but session court also did not allow. The sessions court said you have to go through the trial. We are not discharging you from the charges.
Right.
Yeah. Anything from you, sir? Shailesh, sir?
Yeah, I think not to take things lightly and to keep Hitesh Bhai's number with you.
What I want to tell you is, friends, when it comes to a medical related problem, please consult somebody who is medical legally sound. Okay. And there are few people, because all lawyers don't know all the laws. You understand that? As I don't know family laws, I don't know the land requisition law, I don't know many laws. There are more than 10,000 laws. And among the lawyers, usually they take up any case because they cannot refuse the case. So they have to take all the case. They take all the case and they don't refer. Like if I, as a gynecologist, when I was practicing, if I get patient with heart pain or chest pain, I will refer him to cardiologist. But no such system is there in the legal world. So please go to somebody who knows the law, first thing. And second thing, make your documents solid and have fearless practice. Always then, and the offense is the best defense. Always try to put your full strength in offense as well, not only into the defense. Because we are so much into the defensive mode. I want all the doctors to come out of that and have a fearless practice. That is what is my message. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
You will remember that a few months ago in Pune, one hospital actually won a defamation case against a patient.
Yes.
And
yes,
they
sir.
won crores of rupees as a compensation.
Yes, sir.
Right. Thank you very much, Hitesh Bhai. And we now move on to our expert, Dr. G S Bhattacharyya, for his expert comments and question and answers. Dr. G S, please.
Thanks, Purvish. It's been a long day, and I think it's coming to an end. I didn't see too many questions in the question box, except for a couple of questions. One would be that if there are multiple stakeholders, okay, of these stakeholders, the subject is a stakeholder. Suppose he doesn't follow what's on the clinical trial, what happens? The Compensation Act didn't take into that if there is a patient who is not follow the doctor's advice or has had an alternative medicine, what happens to that? That becomes an important question. Anyway, we have seen that Purvish has actually put up some slides here, I think. So we have seen huge legal suits that are coming in, and the SAE formula is now. Let me just try and tell it to you that this clinical trial compensation could have been done in many of the methods. One was a market model, the other was a wage model, the third was the reimbursement model, and fourth was the appreciation model. These are models that are known. These models could have been followed, but I think we took a hybrid model, and the hybrid model was a wage model with the reimbursement model. The second thing is that sometimes it wonders to me about this compensation thing. It's a law, we have to follow it now, but when this law was being drawn up, I wish people would have paid attention to certain things. That when you're talking of healthy volunteer participating in a trial and injury, and when you're talking of a seriously sick patient who is on a clinical trial, we should have had different systems of compensation being adjudged. Although the formula tries to get this thing rectified, but it cannot because there are certain issues there. I will always try to say an SAE for compensation should be based on certain things. That one, our guidelines are telling us that everyone who's on a clinical trial should be compensated. I do understand, but please, I would ask our legal experts and people who are into trials to remember there is something called the distributive justice. This was not taken into account when the trial was done. I would also try and point out to all our trialists that yes, we are following no fault compensation. We have looked at the various models, the successful models that are available for this no fault compensation that can be taken. I would like everyone to take home, and I would start from the last, is be bold, be honest, be transparent, and be clear, and please put down your observations in writing in the proper manner. Second part of it is that whenever you are in doubt, please take help from a proper legal advice there. Even in clinical trials, there should be a legal advice taken up for clinical trials when we are actually doing it. I would also like to get into a particular statement that was made regarding unlocking the code or unlocking the blinding process. That is a blinding process which is actually inbuilt into the clinical protocol much before the trial starts. And I think that is what is of importance, and that is what is required. I would warn everyone that this Compensation Act only talks of the compensation of the trial, but it can lead into a civil court law, which has been very well explained by Dr. Hitesh, and that is important. We have to keep in mind our reportings of SAEs, which has to be done in a time-proof manner, in details, and with causality clearly referred. We often cannot come to a causality, but then that would call for a clean discussions. We need to make our system a bit more watertight and then take it forward. Overall, this has been a great learning experience today. And I would say, well, Purvish, thanks a lot for letting me sum it up. And before I actually finish it off for the evening, I'll make one small comment, and that comment is supposed to be that please remember that clinical trials was Destination India. We are just getting back to it. I hope we have more responsible civil societies. We have more responsible medias, and we as our own selves as trialists or regulators, we become more responsible. Thanks a lot, and good night to everyone.
Thank you very much, GS. I'll now take the questions. This Malhotra Sundi has said this question. So the first thing is that the patient has claimed the compensation of 5 crores, but it does not as per the calculations that will happen in DCGI. First of all, the patient is alive, he is not dead. Secondly, he does not have any permanent disability. Third is that he was treated at the hospital for some neurological problem, and then he was discharged. So he does not have a permanent disability. In this case, even if the DCGI calculates a no claim compensation, it will be maybe 20 or 30,000 rupees. As GS and Hitesh Bhatt has said, he still can go to a civil court, but then he will have to prove that actually negligence occurred. So the next question is by Dr. Sailesh Bondade. Maximum compensation is 75 lakhs in a trial, but can be 11 crores otherwise. So in a civil court or a criminal court, of course, the compensation can be higher, as we saw in the case of the Kunal Saha versus Sukumaran Mukherjee and AMRI Hospital, where it was compensation was 11.6 crores. Now, this is a question that I have put myself. So, GS, if you can answer this question.
Purvish, I think so. I did touch upon this and go, and that was by making the statement that the stakeholder, the patient himself is a stakeholder, and he should understand, and it should be incorporated in the trial that he has to follow. And if he doesn't follow that, that also should be documented.
But as far as I know, under the DCGI rules just now,
It's not there.
There is no obligation of the patient to do anything.
Exactly, and this is what I think Hitesh Bhai was trying to point out.
Yes.
That on the point of the distributive system of justice, which I just made on the passing, this would be a offense on behalf of the patient, and he may not be able to take a complaint. Yes, Dr. Hitesh.
Yes. So what I wanted to tell you in the contract, that is what I wanted to highlight, that you also have to write not only what is given in the table 3, you have to add further more tabs into the contract where the patient's duties is also very clearly written. And if they don't follow that, it will be contributory negligence from their side as well. And in that such eventuality, the compensation will not be paid. That also should be the terms and conditions. Then let them fight for that. But at least you put this type of conditions in.
Yeah, but the problem is, Hitesh Bhai, what will happen is the ethical committees or even the DCGI will not allow the trial to start with that sort of a statement. That's the problem.
No, but duties you can always put, sir. You can always put what are the patient's duties.
Yeah, we can put the do's and don'ts for a patient.
Yes, do's and don'ts for the patient you can always put in a contract, and then it will, or then only it will be a balanced contract. When law is not balanced, at least we have to make our documents balanced.
Agreed.
Wonderful. And Dr. Vinayak has put a nice suggestion that we should have one clinical trial PI meeting for experience sharing. Vinayak, with your help, we will definitely do that. I hand it over back to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank our faculty members for conducting a wonderful session, and also the delegates for actively participating. I would also like to thank our supporters, MedicLogic, Intas Oncology, and Indian Cooperative Oncology Network. So with that, I would like we can close the session.
Yes.
Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a wonderful discussion, and we can continue the next phase of this discussion on the basis of what Dr. Hitesh has brought out and what Dr. Arun Agarwal and the others have brought out. So good night, everybody. Stay safe. Hopefully the pandemic will end soon, but in the meantime, we still have to continue taking precautions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Parikh. Thank you very much.